Good evening. I'm very excited to have this discussion because tonight we're talking about Alberta's separation from Canada, or at least the potential of Alberta separating from Canada. And here with me are two very special guests. We've had Judy on the show before. Judy, welcome back. And now we're also joined with Derek Fildebrandt, who is actually based in Alberta. Derek, thank you so much for joining us as well. Great to have you guys on. Of course, we're talking about Alberta's separatist movement and sort of what that looks like. And a lot of people, I think, in other parts of Canada, maybe even in Alberta, don't fully understand what is going on. And so, Derek, I sort of wanted to have you elaborate a little bit on your stance with the situation, your view, and really where it stems from. Has this been an issue the last few decades? Has this been an issue the last decade, the last couple of years? Give me sort of the scoop on that.
Well, I'll try to give you the Coles notes. It goes back even pre-Confederation, when Alberta was a part of Rupert's land in the Northwest Territories, this kind of vaguely governed colony of Canada, not yet a province. The Northwest Territories, we have what is the Northwest Territories today, but it used to include all three of the territories, all of Alberta, Saskatchewan, most of Manitoba. The very genesis goes back to provincehood in 1905. The colonial legislature, Premier Haltain at the time, wanted a province called Buffalo, which would encompass Alberta and Saskatchewan. But that was vetoed by the Laurier government at the time in 1905, because they didn't want to create another large English-speaking province, which would maybe unbalance things with Quebec. And even Ontario didn't want another potential big rival. And so the idea was to have a small divided West. And the provinces in the West, Alberta and Saskatchewan, they were, and to a lesser extent Manitoba, they were the only provinces that were not already crown colonies and negotiate their way into Canada. The original four provinces, and then eventually Prince Edward Island, British Columbia, and then much, much later on in the 1950s, Newfoundland, they were quasi-independent colonies, and they negotiated their way and they were able to get deals. How many Senate seats do we have? Control of natural resources. So Alberta and Saskatchewan were not like that. The federal government said, here's the deal, and we're creating it. And you'd have no say in it, over your borders, over what rights you have. It didn't include things like control over natural resources, which all of the other provinces, the older provinces, did have. And so there's been rumblings and discontent about this going back even before Alberta and Saskatchewan became provinces. It never really bubbled to the surface as a significant movement, however, until the early 1980s with the National Energy Program under Pierre Trudeau.
And Derek, can I just jump in there just to get an idea on Judy's side? Judy, just because we have about 2 minutes here, as we saw, because I was doing some research on this in 1980, the energy discussion, that sort of became an issue. And I know it's been exasperated ever since in the last 10 years. Judy, when you sort of heard the rumblings of this just on your end, and it's now getting more serious, what were sort of your thoughts, or in conversations you've had, what were your thoughts in what people are thinking here in Ontario or in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, I don't think that people in Ontario really do think about Alberta very often. And the last time that I really considered this was in the last Canadian election cycle. We know that as, conservatives, we really rely on Alberta to be the blue voting base. We know we can count on Alberta to vote conservative, and therefore the election, question for us conservatives in Ontario really become who's going to turn blue, who's going to vote conservative or liberal. Then it comes down to really focused ridings. So when I was really thinking about that situation, that's when the whole idea of separatism really came to play, because on a national level, Alberta is so uniquely blue, at least historically it has been, and that really is quite different politically speaking, not just economically and historically. And I knew that those sentiments were going to bubble up more and more, especially if the federal government went to the Liberals again, which obviously it did.
Obviously it did, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Derek, we have about 20 seconds here. Give me sort of just your stance on the situation, just in Cole's notes, if you don't mind. And I'm going to give you the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more in the next segment.
Most Albertans do not hate Canada. They're actually the most patriotic Albertans, especially Albertans who find themselves supporting independence. It's that they don't believe Canada is reformable. They don't think it could be sufficiently changed to accommodate us. And they think more recently, much more addition to the more recent addition to the independence movement. They don't think Canada itself can be saved from its own actions.
So as we continue our conversation on Alberta separatism, I want to see if the moment holds, what does leaving Canada actually look like for Alberta and for the rest of Canada? Joining me is Derek Fildebrandt and Judy Jo. Derek, we got about 30 seconds here before I want to throw it over to Judy, but walk me through this build of what Alberta looks like. I mean, I know we've had other conversations about this before, an Alberta police force replacing the RCMP, an Alberta pension plan, even though the CPP is like really well managed, one of the best funds in the world, I believe. Just kind of what's already on the table. What's the discussion around that?
Well, those are all items that there's a large segment of Alberta that wants to do those things with or without of Canada. Even if Alberta remains a province, wants to do those things. Look, what Alberta looks like on the other end, it could take many different forms. It could be a republic, or it could remain a constitutional monarchy with the same head of state, the King of England or the King of the UK, as with Canada. Remember when Canada, at the point of Confederation, it was, in a sense, a kind of separation from Britain, but also not really. It was just a reconsolidation of powers from colonial legislatures into what we now call the House of Commons and the Senate. But it still remained within the British imperial system.
And Derek,
there's several forms this could take.
Just a quick question on this. Like, for what purpose? Like, I believe the energy discussion is probably like the major reason why Albertans or Alberta separatists want to separate. And that's why they're okay with still sort of being under Canada, but they want their own say on where their energy goes and if they can extract oil out of the ground. Or
No, I mean, look, the much older discussion was around equalization, federal, the National Energy Program taking Alberta's oil money for itself. Under Justin Trudeau second, it evolved into him actively stymieing Alberta's resource development, our ability to generate money and give it to the rest of Canada. But it's no longer just about that. It's become a much more cultural issue that Canada has given up its own inheritance. Canada has stopped being the Canada that we were born into and that we love. That Canada, unfortunately, too many people outside of the West vote for seizing our guns, votes for censorship, votes for mass unrestricted migration, votes for politicians that denigrate the great symbols of Canada, statues of Sir John A. Macdonald, changing the national anthem to make it politically correct. This Alberta is not like Quebec nationalism that has something that's anti-Canadian. We are the most Canadian part of Canada. And we feel, many of us feel, that Canada has abandoned that great inheritance, that great history, that great tradition. And we no longer want to be tied to a sinking ship, but it's time to cut the line.
Judy, just to throw it over to you. Derek, thanks for that. Judy, just to throw it over to you. I mean, like, realistically speaking, how realistic is this? I mean, I know your views even on the federal government right now, Judy. Like, not everybody has to be happy, but does that mean we have to call for separatism? And if Ontarians feel the same way, should they ask to get out of Canada?
Right. I think it's really interesting because it's almost like what happens when you have a province that is overwhelmingly conservative and so different from the federal government and have had to suffer under that leadership for a decade plus. And I think this is the result of what happens when there's such a difference of opinions between the federal government leadership and policies and the provinces. And because Alberta represents, a large portion of conservative voters, I can understand why they want to separate. The truth is, it's, all of the points that Derek made, I think many people would actually agree with him in rural parts of Ontario, in different parts and in different provinces in Canada, but it's just almost a representative of an entire province that has just a lot of odds with the federal government's views.
But aren't we seeing this sort of change? I mean, even Danielle Smith came out and said, we're seeing the federal government make steps to remediate some of these pain points. I like, not knowing so much about it, I feel that they are. Derek, we've only got about 30 seconds here at most. What's your response to that?
Mark Carney is certainly less annoying. He doesn't have, we have a term in German for Justin Trudeau, a Backpfeifengesicht, which means a punchable face. He does not have a punchable face. And that is an improvement over the way it was. But we have seen absolutely no progress in substance yet. It's been roughly a year he's been in office. We've had a lot of good rhetoric, but nothing in substance. But to Judy's point, I think she's largely correct, but missing what's fundamentally underlying it. Yeah, we vote conservative, but even the conservatives can take us for granted.
Continuing our conversation on Alberta separatism, Derek, you made a statement in the last segment that I want to throw it back to you on. You said the conservatives, well, they may even go against you on Judy's point about Alberta being very conservative. Let me ask you this question. We haven't seen the conservatives in power for well over a decade. Who's to say that they wouldn't change?
Their own platform. I would not say the conservatives go against Alberta, but they don't really go very strongly for it. And there's very good reasons for that. The electoral math of the country. They could count on getting the votes of conservatives really no matter what they do because the alternative is so awful. So Albertans just vote conservative reflexively as kind of the home team. But then all of the promises that actually would cost votes or something, they're made for other parts of the country. Changing equalization. Andrew Scheer, it was Stephen Harper, Andrew Scheer, Aaron O'Toole, Pierre Poilievre. Not one of them has ever promised even extremely moderate reforms to something like equalization, taking our money and giving it to others who vote against our interests, because it would cost them votes in other parts of the country that they need to win to form government. The Conservatives will promise things like resource development, pipeline access, things like that are actually popular everywhere, or in most parts of Canada, because we do have allies outside. I'm not under any illusions that everyone hates Alberta, but as Judy said at the top, most just don't think about us. And at the end of the day, they're going to vote for their interests, not someone else's. So the Conservatives, they're not against us. They're just not that strongly for us because they don't have to be. And they're not going to solve our problems. So Pierre Poilievre was in Calgary just the other day saying, you don't have to vote to leave. You just have to vote for me. But here's the problem. We've done that every single time for the last 70 years, and we're still where we are right now.
I hear you on that, Derek, and I actually appreciate you sharing that. Judy, just on your point there around, I talked to you about this. Let's say realistically Alberta does separate. 1/4 of their GDP, I believe, is through oil and natural gas, potentially even more. Let me ask you honestly, where would Alberta sell their oil or natural gas to? Canada? If so, they would be their largest customer, or the US, they would be their largest customer. Would Canada and the US just not have a lot of leverage to sort of drive down energy costs with Alberta?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to kind of touch on something that Derek said. I think Derek represents a lot of the frustrations that Alberta has faced with the last decade plus of Liberal federal leadership. And I suspect that if pipelines, would have been greenlit, 10 years ago, then these sentiments wouldn't be as strong as they are today. I think there's really a backlog of frustration that are being expressed in the separatist movement. I also suspect that many Albertans may not actually vote to separate. I think speaking of leverage, the separatist movement is asking for is a little leverage with the federal government that, hey, you have said no to us for so long. If you keep saying no to us the way that Justin Trudeau did, then we can actually leave. We have one other pathway other than continually being suppressed. And I think that's really the heart of what this movement is about.
I do feel, a stat came out, Ipsos did a study in May that I just want to touch on, but I hear the frustrations. This I found quite interesting. So recent pollings had suggested that roughly 3 in 5 Albertans actually voted to stay in Canada, and separation support fell from 28% in January to 18% by late May. This is Angus Reid and Ipsos. What does that say to you, Derek, about how Albertans are feeling about this? Do they think it's worth it to go through all of this, or just kind of stick it out and let Mark Carney sort of do a better job than maybe what you feel Trudeau had done the last 10 years?
Well, the polls have been all over. Of course, anytime anyone hears a poll that is not good for their side, they say, oh, well, that one's bunk. I don't know. That would be historically low. The highest we've ever seen it hit is lapping the shores of 40%. It's never been into majority territory as yet. The lowest I've ever seen, though, was 25%. So I would be utterly shocked to see it at 18. I have a hard time believing that. But but what is fair to say is it's probably it's a strong minority position right now. It is not a majority, but it does make up a solid majority of United Conservative Party voters, which is why they're able to leverage that and put it on the agenda. Alberta Conservatives change leaders nearly as often as the United Kingdom, and we do it when we don't get our way. So Danielle Smith really has no choice but to allow this through a citizens' initiative the way we're seeing right now. But I don't. Some people see it as a leverage point following the Quebec playbook, but most people in the movement do not see this as leverage. They see it as independence. This is not sovereignty association word games like Quebec has played. This is most Albertans, even in the independent side, at least the moderate independent side, they would perform a significantly reformed.
Closing our conversation on Alberta separatism, I just want to get into and react a little bit on what is actually happening this month, where the discussion is. Derek, you had brought up a point about how this really isn't being used as leverage, although in some capacity it is with the UCP. One thing that I found quite interesting was the vote that's coming up on October 19th of 2026 is not a vote to leave Canada. Yes, they vote it and they leave. It's just a vote to say, okay, we can explore the legal process now. Is Danielle Smith just doing this to appease sort of her party and try to play politics? Judy, I want to let you just jump on this really quick, and then Derek, I'll let you respond.
Yeah, I mean, she's come out and said that she supports a united Canada, but this is going to be put to the vote. In some ways, you can't help but think that she is just appeasing, the separatist movement in Alberta, because as a premier, what choice do you really have, right? Even if she secretly wanted to leave or secretly wants to stay, whichever position she truly holds, she has no choice but to put this to referendum. However, like we were discussing, it's probably an output of a lot of frustrations. And Sam, you mentioned that, support for separating has been going down in recent months. It's because, frankly, if you look at the context of what we're talking about, we have bigger fish to fry in the world and as a nation, and even for Alberta. So to talk about separating right now, in one way, it's like she has to do it. And then in another way, I think it's just going to fizzle out.
I appreciate that. Derek, I just want to throw this over to you. Like, what do you see that needs to change from Ottawa in order for Alberta to be happy? Because, I mean, it's not fair to say that all of Canada has to share Albertan values, though they can respect Albertan values. What are your thoughts there?
Like we did with Quebec.
Like we did with Quebec, yeah. I mean, even Quebec ruled it now. If you don't speak French in certain advertising campaigns, like you can actually be fined, which I find quite interesting. But Derek, would love your thoughts.
Well, look, a key principle of conservatism is decentralization. That governance should take place at the lowest possible practical level. And that means further decentralization. Quebec got the kind of decentralization it wanted on largely cultural issues. We have not gotten the decentralization we want, which is on fiscal redistributive socialist issues. We did not get decentralization on things like the right to own firearms responsibly. But we also don't get appropriate action from the federal government in areas where it is supposed to be competent, which is national infrastructure, trade, that kind of thing. So the federal government's not doing its job where it's supposed to be, and it is.
Where do you feel that they could improve,
itself
though,
in where
Derek?
it should be.
Like where do you feel that they could improve with that? Because I mean, even Danielle Smith came out and said, like, we're seeing progress. They're listening to me. They're hearing me. They're hearing what Albertans want. Maybe they're not moving quick enough, but
I certainly hope that Premier Smith is right. But I fear she is being led along the garden path, and that is the fear of many of us, that she is dealing in good faith with Carney. Many of us are just not yet convinced that he's dealing in good faith. We've seen nothing here. The investment climate for this kind of, for pipeline infrastructure, further oil sands development has been totally cratered. We have not seen the repeal of all of the No More Pipelines bill. We haven't seen the repeal of the West Coast Alberta tanker ban. Chinese tankers are allowed to fly the West Coast, but Alberta tankers are not, or Canadian tankers are not. So I'm highly mistrustful. I think we've had over 100 years of this. I think it's incumbent on the rest of Canada, it's incumbent on the Federalists to say, here's what we're prepared to do. It's not incumbent on frustrated Albertans anymore to say, okay, we're prepared to sit back and wait another 100 years to get treated as an equal partner in this country. It's up to the Federalists to say, okay, we're willing to come to the table and talk. And I've seen no indication of that.
Judy, just to close it out here, about 30 seconds, what would you say to Ottawa? What do you think needs to happen in order for this to sort of subside, considering Derek's concerns?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is Alberta's concerns are not quite so different from the concerns that Quebec had, right? And even Quebec had an even more compelling cultural argument with their own distinct language and history and religious differences from going back to the founding of this nation. Except Alberta has money, and that is the one big hand that they're able to wave as, this is what I have. This is what I have in my hand. I have all of the money, and I provide this much money to equalization payments, and those concerns are valid. However, we don't run in a system where whoever contributes the most gets the most say.
We want to hear from you, especially if you disagreed or feel we missed something important. Join the conversation at My Generation on all social media platforms. And remember, do not simply accept what you are told. Challenge your thinking, engage in differences, and listen to new perspectives. I'ma rule the world, yeah.